The goal of the Israelis, obviously, is to get as many, if not all, of the hostages out before they resume military action. But military action will be forthcoming. You cannot afford to have Hamas remain intact as far as its infrastructure and leadership is concerned. And the Israelis are not going to sit back and say, well, we got our hostages back, but we'll live with this kind of threat on our border for the indefinite future. So that's not going to happen. So I would expect after the Israelis conclude they've got as many out as they can for the time being, they're likely to start the bombing again. But they will do it on a less massive basis, a much more discreet, targeted basis, because they've seen the world reaction to when you have wholesale bombing and the killing of innocent civilians. That makes them not a victim anymore, but a villain in the eyes of all of those in the region and much of the world community. And so I think they'll take that into consideration, be much more targeted, much more direct, and minimize the loss of innocent civilians in the air.
Well, that's certainly the hope of this administration. Of course, Mr. Secretary, that's one thing that Antony Blinken is urging, but we know it's coming. Benjamin Netanyahu says there's no situation in which we do not go back to fighting until the end. That's a direct quote. Hamas continues to say October 7th was a dress rehearsal. What are the optics going to be when this resumes?
Well, Mr. Netanyahu has made it clear that he has to reduce, if not eliminate, the entire infrastructure, the military infrastructure of Hamas. He's not going to yield on that point. But you have the President Biden and Antony Blinken sending the signal behind the doors, so to speak, through emissaries, perhaps even our CIA chief, to say, be careful here, because you have an existential interest at risk here, but we have interests at risk in the greater region. We do not want to see this go further, because now our troops will be certainly in the firing line. We'll have some of the Islamic groups targeting our soldiers, whether in Syria, in the greater Middle East, in Saudi Arabia, and elsewhere. So I think we have an interest in helping the Israelis defend themselves and take on Hamas. We also have an interest in making sure that the Israelis don't pursue their mission in a way that jeopardizes our interests in the region, as well as the greater stability between the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Qatar. All of those countries have an interest in seeing this not spread. So that is why Secretary Blinken, that is why President Biden is urging some restraint on the part of Netanyahu.
Secretary Cohen, Israel believes 145 hostages are still being held in Gaza. Once fighting resumes, is hope lost?
It's not lost because the hostages were held before the attacks began by the Israelis. The Hamas didn't kill all of them. They knew what they always do and know. The more they hold out, the more concessions the Israelis and the West is going to insist upon before the hostages will be released. So they're playing this very deadly game. It's really vicious, cynical. We'll let a few out, and then we'll see how much time we can buy in order to reposition our forces. We'll let a few more out, and we'll put the pressure on the Israelis to make more concessions. And that's the game they've always played, and the one they're playing right now, because the world opinion basically does not want to see people being killed. We're living in the age of information. You've got immediacy. You've got the intensity of it. You've got the polarization of public opinion. And then you have all of that coming down the Israelis saying, hey, back off.
Yeah.
You've made your point. You've killed enough of the Hamas fighters. So let's just go back to the way it was. And the Israelis are saying, no, we're not going back there. We're going to make sure that you're not going to ever do this to us again. So they're in it for the long haul. President Biden is saying, we're with you, but make sure you are much more discreet, much more concerned about killing innocent Palestinians. The more you kill, the more enemies you're making, the less public support you're going to have. You have us, maybe the Brits, but there isn't anybody else in the world that's going to be with you. So we have a voice here. Our voice is one of urging restraint to the extent we can. And I think that is what's taking place right now.
Fascinating. We were quick to move 2 carrier strike groups into the region following October 7th. We've talked about that. Of course, the Jerry Ford and the Ike, and they've decided to move in different paths. But we've surged resources into the region. Maybe we should take credit for the fact that that's why we don't have a second or third front. You mentioned that as well, open at this point. But going forward, you ran the Pentagon, sir. What should be our military posture when fighting resumes?
Our military posture has to remain the same. This is a signal to Hezbollah, it's a signal to Iran, to any who mean to see this thing spread, that we are there and we will respond. To the extent that you have the Houthis firing missiles at our ships, if you have any of the Iranian proxies firing and targeting our soldiers, there's going to be a response. And we'll have a major response and calibrate that depending upon what they're doing. So if they have a major attack upon us, I think all holes are off at that point. So it's a signal that we're there. We're there as a deterrent. We're there to defend our forces and to preserve the peace and stability to the extent it exists in the region. That's our mission. And can I just say one more word?
Yeah, please.
I can't let this pass without noting the passing of Henry Kissinger, who was a dear friend of mine whom I've known for 50 years. And I think that he would be one who certainly made every effort to bring peace to the Middle East, but so has every other former Secretary of State. But he was special, and I think we won't see the likes of him ever again.
Well, I'm glad you brought it up because I wanted to ask you about him. There's so much talk of legacy. Obviously, this is an American icon, but it's also a controversial man. You're speaking affectionately about him. What would you tell people who criticize his activities, for instance, in Cambodia or Laos, and some people who would say that he violated international law?
Henry Kissinger was the man in the arena, as was Richard Nixon. Anyone who steps in that arena is going to get criticism as well as compliments. I knew Henry Kissinger on a personal level and saw a different side of him. He certainly was brilliant beyond measure. He certainly was concerned about order and peace. And there's a little paradox as you think about it. He would say, or paraphrase, he'll say, you can't have, if you have liberty, you have to have order. You can't have liberty without order. If you have liberty without order, you have a mess. If you have order without liberty, you've got a menace. And Kissinger was always trying to balance, how do we preserve freedom and balance that with having order? You cannot have one without the other. And I think that was his mission. And he made some very tough decisions. And yes, people died as a result of it. But most of us in the world is better off for Henry Kissinger having lived and given guidance to so many presidents over the years.
It's pretty remarkable to think he was sitting in Beijing with President Xi just weeks ago, Secretary. I don't know when the last time was you spoke with him, but what would he do right now with this situation in Israel?
I saw him most recently in April. There was a celebration of his 100th birthday at CSIS, the Center for Strategic International Studies. He was there with Eric Schmidt, the head of Google, and they were talking about AI. And once again, Henry was worried about artificial intelligence getting out of control, which would lead to an extinction level event. And that's what he's always been concerned about. His first book was Nuclear Power and Foreign Policy. That was the book he wrote back in 1969. And that's while he was professor at Harvard. Since that time, he had been writing about how do we maintain peace and order in an ever-turbulent, spinning world, kaleidoscopic changes taking place. How do we preserve stability and order and freedom? That has been his life's mission, and it was right up until the time he died because he was working